Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Hello all. Welcome to the webinar that has been organized by me and Safia and some of our other colleagues from Central Asian Research Network. London Central Asian Research Network. We have been organizing this kind of events already in the last couple of years, but this particular initiative is mostly about discussing publication strategies and successful publication strategies. So today we have Bill Hayton, who is the editor of Asian Affairs Journal, which is actually the academic journal of the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. And he was formerly a journalist with BBC News and worked in Vietnam and Myanmar. He is the author of 4 books, Vietnam, Rising Dragon, The South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia, The Invention of China, and The Brief History of Vietnam. And he's also an associate fellow with the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. So what we're going to do today is basically, we'll give the floor to Bill to talk about some of the strategies that he thinks would be really useful for early career researchers, especially from our region, Central Asian region, or from Asia, and he will talk about what would make a publication, kind of go through this process through, the editors, where they look through the publication, the monograph, or the research output, and then they decide, does it go through the review process or not, or they just reject it, at this stage. So I think it's going to be really useful for a lot of early career researchers, because sometimes I do hear, those kind of things, especially from early career researchers from Central Asia, where we talk about things like, okay, it's not being, accepted. I have like tons of rejections from different journals, and we can use this kind of suggestions when we do prepare our publications for submissions to different kind of journals. Bill, of course, will be really interested if we do submit any publications to his journal, having this hat of an editor of Asian Affairs. But I think we can take it also as a kind of general advice as well. So I'll give the floor to Bill now, and we can also ask questions later on as well. Just 1 second. So housekeeping kind of rules. So if you have any questions, maybe you can start typing them in the chat, but we'll look at them after. Probably you can finish your a little talk first, and then we can take the questions one by one from the chat, or you can also raise it, by yourself. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Gulzat. Thank you for the opportunity. And I hope, as you were hinting at the end, this is a kind of mutually beneficial arrangement. I can help you get published, and you can help me fill my journal with good papers, articles that other people want to read. So I was appointed the editor of Asian Affairs in June. This is my first time as the editor of an academic journal. So I worked as I guess you might call it a mainstream journalist before that, but I've had a particular interest in Southeast Asia for the last 15 years. But the history of this particular journal is quite heavily connected with the part of the world that you're interested in. The Royal Society for Asian Affairs was formerly the Royal Central Asian Society, and the journal's been going for just over 100 years. And the journal emerged out of all that sort of imperialist intrigue, the Great Game and all that kind of stuff in the early 20th century. And the society was a kind of club, really, for people who had come back from Asia and wanted to keep their interest going and had an interest in policy and all the rest of it. But we've grown and developed since then. And if you look at any of the articles or any of the issues that are the most recent one, the one that's about to come out, any of the ones going back the last few years, you'll find people there, authors from India, from Central Asia, from Vietnam, from China. And so it's not just a club for British or even Western authors. We want it to be a genuinely Asian journal. But as the editor, the biggest problem that I'm finding is I get an awful lot of material which I have to read, which isn't very good. And so I'm very keen to encourage more and better submissions, really. And I would say that I have a particular problem, and since we're talking about Central Asia, I have a particular problem with papers or articles from Kazakhstan. And it might be interesting that there seems to be a business, I don't know where it's based, encouraging, particularly it seems, Kazakh academics to process their articles through this business. And they always come to me, they're formatted in the same way, they have the same style. And there are various other things about them which I won't say because I don't want to give the game away, which are clear to me that these are being written by a contractor, not by the academics themselves. And so if anybody knows anything about that, please don't submit your stuff to me because I can spot it coming, and it's not going to help you get published, okay? I don't know whether this is true for other people, but I really want to encourage good, original papers from Kazakhstan and from other countries as well. Things that are, going to interest a general audience. So my journal is interesting because it has a membership, about 1,000 people who have a sort of broad interest in Asia, but the number of downloads through electronic access is vastly more. It's well over 100,000, per year downloads across the journal. So although I have to kind of please a membership, which is largely British based, I also have a kind of global audience as well. And I would say that I'm looking for sort of 4 things really in any article that I want to publish. I'm looking for a strong argument. Sometimes what I get is just a review. These things have happened, and it feels a bit like, a master's thesis or even an undergraduate thesis at times, a kind of summary of information that, if anybody following this particular subject would probably already know. And I'm looking for something more than that. I want an argument. I want a kind of way of understanding the world, connecting bits of information and telling us how we should interpret this evidence that's being presented from. So an argument is the first thing. I also want a kind of narrative that kind of tells the story of how we, a situation changed over time, or how we got to where we are now, the different factors and influences that caused the current situation. I like an analytical framework. I like references maybe to other pieces of work to build on the existing literature. But for my particular journal, we're not particularly interested in theory. We don't want kind of very abstract discussions. There's nothing that turns me off more than a sort of something that just sort of bangs on about whether I'm a liberalist or a constructivist or whatever. That doesn't really add much to it. There are places, there are journals that really get into their international relations theory or whatever, but Asian affairs isn't one of them. And that doesn't mean I don't, I like a little bit of theory. I like a connection to existing academic material, showing why somebody's arguments from one area can be applied in another area, or why a particular argument is wrong in this particular context. That's fine with me, but I don't want anything too abstract. But I think above all, it's got to be an original contribution. It's got to be something new, maybe writing about a new subject that we haven't in our journal touched on before, or looking at it in a new way, or updating an old article or an old viewpoint to bring it up to date and making it relevant. And when I'm thinking of an audience, I'm looking at a global audience. Electronically, you know, these downloads can reach anybody anywhere in the world, and they do, and we can see the download figures and where they're coming from. So those are the sort of the 4 things that I'm really, you know, interested in. In terms of my journal, it's a relatively short length for each articles. We suggest 5,000 to 7,000 words, which is shorter than, you know, than many journals will allow you to go up to 10,000 or even 15,000. So maybe it's a place where you know, as you're developing your research and you've got some findings, you know, you could do a kind of, you know, preliminary article which talks about those findings, and maybe as a stepping stone towards a bigger article. We also take book reviews, which are much shorter, sort of 700 words or so. And that might be a way, you know, as you're doing sort of literature searches and literature reviews yourself, and you want to keep across updated or kind of new material, and maybe also to kind of just start this process of getting published and getting your name out there, getting an ORCID ID. And I would suggest anybody who hasn't got an ORCID ID, definitely get one. Particularly if you come from a part of the world where lots of people have similar names. Having a good ORCID idea can be very helpful. You know, I had 2 people with the same name from India recently, and they were writing on similar topics, and it wasn't clear to me which person I was dealing with. I had to kind of email both of them and ask them. So an ORCID ID is a good way to establish your identity and to build your, you know, your academic profile. As you know, one of the other things I didn't mention is obviously we want the article to be well written in English, but as the editor, I'm more than happy to help with that. I don't expect somebody whose English is a second language to deliver something to me that's absolutely perfect for publication. There's a kind of limit to how far I can go. I mean, it obviously has to be, you know, workable for me. So I have nothing against, although I mentioned that problem I'm having with these people writing articles for payment. I have no problem with, you know, if you wanted someone to help you with the English side of it before submitting it to me. Maybe that's less of a problem for a group of people if you're already studying in the UK, but people who are overseas might want their English checked or something. But once it gets to a certain level, I'm more than happy to work with authors. And if you, you know, I'm a kind of tinkerer. When it comes to me, I kind of I like to kind of work with the article, kind of make changes where I think it, you know, helps with the flow of the argument, and then send it back to the author for their approval before we kind of take it any further. And I do that because I think it's unfair to, when we go to the next stage, which is to go to a peer review, which is to go to another academic and say, do you think this article is worth publishing? I don't want them to spend their time saying, I don't understand the argument, the English isn't very clear, you know, this could be better expressed. I want a kind of version of the manuscript which, as an editor, I think is written in sound English and the argument is clear, so that when I give it to the peer reviewer, all they're doing is thinking, is this correct? Does the evidence match their understanding of the world? Is this new? All the kind of academic questions, so that the questions to do with, you know, good English and all the rest of it are not, you know, for them to worry about. So generally the process is that somebody submits an article to me, and at the moment we do this in a relatively old-fashioned way. I have an email address, editor@rsaa.org.uk. I look at it and then think about what to do with it next. Other journals have online submission systems with portals, and you have to register, and they're called, you know, Manuscript Central or whatever it is, which are a bit more impersonal, but they do help, you know, the other people at the other side, the people running the journal, to manage the flow. Because if they're getting lots of submissions, they want to know when something was submitted, what stage of the process it is, all the way through to publication, potentially. At the moment, I'm doing a lot of that myself. We will change in due course to a more online system, but for the time being, you get personal attention from me from the very first moment. So what I'll do is give it a kind of a read, and after often I'll make a kind of quick judgment, if it's not for us, if it's the wrong kind of subject, if it seems to me to be too much of a kind of a review of existing knowledge and nothing original, then I'll try and give a kind of quick response. And I try to explain to the author what I think the issue is and what would need to be changed. And I then, if I think it's sort of, good enough to consider, then I'll try and work on if the English requires some work, if the argument isn't clear to me as the editor, then I'll try and suggest some changes or kind of tell the author where I think there's a weakness, and hopefully send it back at that point. Now, some journals kind of have a very sort of precise sort of way of working, and they would say, this is revise and resubmit. I mean, I suppose that's what it is, but I try to keep it a bit less formal at my point and sort of, give some hints. What I'm trying to do here is kind of through the backwards and forwards exchange with the author, get it to the point where I think it's then good enough to go to the peer review. Now, the worst bit for me is sometimes I go backwards and forwards, and at the end of it, and this may have taken a couple of months, I still think it's not good enough to go on to a peer review. And that's quite hard, because I realize that both of us have put quite a lot of effort into reshaping this work, and yet it's still not good enough. And I it really kind of hurts me, to kind of to get to that point and have to kind of give that rejection. It's much easier to reject it kind of straight off, before you've built a relationship, if you like, with the author. But that does happen, and I don't think you should sort of. I mean, you're going to get rejected. It's part of the process. So please don't feel downhearted. I mean, if you just get acceptance all the way through, you're very unusual. Okay, consider yourself a genius. Assume that rejection is part of the plan. Okay, I mean, I get rejected, and revise and resubmit, or this isn't for us. Sometimes it's to do with the journal. Kind of if you look on the most journals are published with a commercial publisher, like, so we're with Taylor and Francis, and of course there are other people, and they will always have an about this journal page on their website. This is what we focus on. We focus on current affairs. We focus on legal development. We focus on international relations theory. We focus on social policy. If you're writing about criminology, don't submit it to an international relations journal. Okay, it's just obvious. You're going to get rejected. Okay, so try and work out the kind of the rubric of the journal so that you're aiming at the right level. There are all these kind of metrics about which journals have the most impact, and you can spend a lot of time working that out. Bear in mind, of course, that everybody else will be doing the same thing, so that those journals that have the sort of highest impact measures will also be attracting lots of other people, and so therefore they're going to have a high threshold. So therefore your article is more likely to get rejected just because of the numbers involved. And at the end of the day, there are also lots of kind of journals at the bottom with very low impact, where a publication may not actually kind of get the attention that you need. And then, of course, there are those sort of what was sometimes called parasitic journals, where it's just pay to publish and they'll accept anything in any quality. And that doesn't really do your reputation any good at all to publish in those kind of journals, because everybody kind of knows that, they don't really have very good quality control, and a publication in there can be done very easily just for paying for it, basically. So you want to aim for something that's relevant to your field, has a reasonably good level of quality and a reputation, but is also accessible. And that might take a few goes to work it out. And you might think where your colleagues are publishing, but you also might want to sort of publish in more than one kind of journal to sort of show that you've got a broad remit, and you're reaching different audiences. I mean, when it comes to attention, and I'm sort of jumping ahead here, after publication, please don't think that just because you published in a journal that anybody's going to notice it. Yeah, you've got to do some work yourself. I mean, me as the editor, I try to publicize articles when they're published, and I go on Twitter and social media, LinkedIn, other venues, to push them out there with sort of keywords and maybe a little kind of sentence or two about what the article is about. But please don't think that just because you're in the journal, that means suddenly everybody's going to know what you've done. Okay, you will have to publicize it yourself, email people, put it on Twitter, put it on your social media feeds. Are you on academia.edu? Are you on ResearchGate? You know, these other websites where scholars go. Do you have a profile on Google Scholar in which you kind of have a little biography about yourself, and Google Scholar is very good at finding out what it is you publish when you publish, but kind of make sure that's being updated all the time, because it's a symbiotic thing. Yeah, you get the publicity, we get the downloads, everybody's happy. Yeah. So you kind of make sure that, you know, and don't feel shy about it. One of the things I learned, I mean, I've published 3 books, about to have a 4th come out. You have to lose all sense of shame when it comes to being an author. Okay, don't worry about kind of anybody thinking that you're, as we say in English, blowing your own trumpet too much. Okay, if you don't blow your own trumpet, no one's going to hear about what you're doing. So feel free to publicize it in all relevant ways. So yeah, I'm happy to sort of take questions and happy to kind of hear your stories about, you know, successes and failures, and maybe offer some suggestions about what you might do differently, and encourage you to kind of, you know, submit stuff to me in due course. Okay.
Thank you, Bill. That was really quite a lot of stuff, actually, and quite a lot of really good advice. I mean, some of the Central Asian scholars might not know what ORCID means. I think we can, I mean, we also have some participants from the mentorship program as well, which just started, and we might actually talk about it later when we officially started. But yes, please, any questions from the audience?
I can see Sophia's got a hand. Oh no, okay, let's go with Natalia first.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Bill. That was a very nice talk. I have a question about the peer review process. So for instance, you get a paper which is focused on Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan. Who gets a chance to read and review it? What would be your strategy? Who would you contact first? Thank you so much.
Okay, this is for me, it's apart from reading lots of not very good material, the second most difficult part of the job is finding good peer reviewers, because really what I'm doing is finding people who are sort of established experts and probably therefore quite busy, and asking them to do some extra work for which they're not going to get paid, but for which their only reward is like karma, some kind of spiritual, you know, feeling that they've done a good thing. Yeah. It's also kind of, some academics find it useful because it helps them to keep an eye on new ideas that are coming up, new bits of research. And if you're a kind of professor, there's always a risk that you're going to get out of touch, you know, that you did your research 20 years ago, and that you're not aware of what's happening now. So for some people, they like peer review because it keeps them in touch with new developments. Some are good citizens and they do peer review because they know that in the big scheme of things, academia as a whole benefits from the peer review process. But it's not uncommon for me to email people and they'll write back and say, sorry, too busy, you know, finishing a book, whatever. And I just have to kind of keep on looking. And so I'm going through Google Scholar, just putting in search terms, finding people who've written on it. Often somebody in an article will reference an article or an author, and it'll just seem to me as, okay, that looks like somebody who actually knows this area. And then sometimes that I like to encourage, you know, the vanity of the peer reviewer, and I say, this person has written an article in which they reference your work quite strongly, you know, would you, you know, kind of in effect repay the compliment by reviewing their work? And that can be a way, that a little hook that I might use to ask a particular person who might be quite well known, you know, to do it. The whole point of peer review is that it's double blind. So I'm the only person that knows who wrote that article and who the reviewer is. Yeah. Obviously, after publication, who wrote the article will become obvious, but the peer reviewer might never be known unless they wish to make themselves known. And the idea is that people can be honest and direct about each other without ever having to be embarrassed if they meet them at a conference or something. And you can, people will know that they're, well, hopefully their work is obvious. Their contribution is obvious in terms of the quality, but the person who says it is hidden, and that helps to keep the process fair, I think. Sometimes, of course, if people are working in a very small field and they know the kind of work that's going on, it may be that reviewers can guess what's going on. But I would have thought for new researchers like yourself, it's very unlikely that the peer reviewer is going to know you, for example. I mean, I'd be happy if somebody were to say to me when it got to the peer review process, this person is my supervisor or whatever, or something. So please don't ask this person to review my manuscript or whatever it might be. I'm happy to take guidance. So yeah, I mean, in general, I do get some pushback. I do get reviewers who decline, but actually, in general, I actually found it okay to get peer reviewers. And then I sort of offer them two options. Sometimes, people like to kind of go through the manuscript, the actual Word document, and they kind of put a comment in and say, this needs updating, don't understand this argument, and it's quite precise and whatever. Sometimes people will just write me a short report and say, I don't think this is ready for publication, it needs to take into account this, this, and this, or I think this is fine, but it needs a little bit of attention here and here. I'm happy to take either. I'm not very prescriptive about how I get that feedback. For me, it's if I've got the article to a level where I think the English is good, the argument appears to be sound. For me, it's like, is this actually good enough to publish academically? Does it sort of fit with the existing literature, or develop it in some way? It's more like a kind of passing an academic test, really, at that point. That's kind of how I see it.
Thank you. Any more questions? That was really good and very detailed.
Okay, I think Sophia, you're putting your hand up.
Yeah, I'm having a question about the situation review and resubmit, and this is my this week's experience. And so, as far as understood, the editor of the journal is very supportive, and he wishes and he sees the potential for the article to be published. And the first reviewer has brilliant comments, very up to the point. But the second reviewer, and you can even tell from the review, didn't get the point of the article, and what they suggest is not in line. And if to do that sort of reason, how are you dealing with taking criticism but not going overstepping your role as an author? Thank you.
Yeah, this can be quite difficult because, as you say, sometimes people don't get the point of your article. I think in general, and I'm actually in a situation now where I'm in a revise and resubmit thing for something that I've written for a different journal, and I sort of, part of me is tempted to go, the reason you don't, you're saying this is because you haven't seen the material that I'm working with, and argue with them. But I recognize that isn't going to get me published, because at the end of the day, the editor is the gatekeeper. And it's up to them to kind of let it go. So it's much easier, for you to kind of go, okay, I accept this criticism and I have addressed it in the following way. I have, changed my introduction to make my argument clearer. I have, made these other following changes, because then imagine if you published, imagine if this journal published your work as it was, and then the reviewer who had disagreed, kind of then contacts the editor and says, you ignored everything I said. What was the point of my peer review? You know, it's a waste of my time and your time and da 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 da. So I think it helps the editor if you can respond, make some changes and explain what you've done to address those comments, because then they can face the peer reviewer whom, if they come back and criticize the decision. Okay, I mean, they might not do that, but that's always the kind of thing in the back of your head. You don't want the whispers to go around the academic community. You know, this journal doesn't take any notice of what the peer reviewers say. It's a waste of time, because then, you know, I lose my peer reviewers and all the rest of it. So yeah, I think do try to address those points if you can. It's not unusual to have different peer reviewers take a different view on things, and that's partly the art of the editor to decide whose views on balance are better and whether they agree. I guess the editor has the casting vote, you might say, if it's a kind of 1-all draw. But it obviously really helps if you can address, you know, some things. I mean, I've had a couple of articles where you know, they're written from one particular perspective, and you know, sometimes, for example, anthropologists get very picky about, you know, the positionality of the author and da 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 da, whereas I'm talking about a short answer, and I don't really want to get too much into, you know, the kind of navel gazing side of it, to be rude, and I'm prepared to kind of just go with the main flow. You know, is this a contribution in this area, even if it doesn't necessarily, particularly American academics can get really picky about certain aspects of writing, in a way I think the British academics, you know, don't. I mean, I'm generalizing quite a lot here. So sometimes you get a different kind of view about whether something is written in an acceptable way from an American reviewer than, say, from a European reviewer. And so there are all these sort of things that go into your decision. But yeah, I think in general, try to address everything that the peer reviewers say. I mean, I've had some people who, they're very precise. They kind of say, they give me almost like a sort of, well, they give me a column and they say, the reviewer said this, I say this. The reviewer said this, I have addressed this here. You know, that can be a way just to kind of show that you've addressed the issues. But actually, for me, I didn't really like that arguing back. It was kind of like, the reviewer says this, I disagree. It'd be much better if you said, the reviewer says this, I have made changes to the introduction to explain this, or whatever. You know, then it kind of feels better. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Shanbei?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Hello,
we can hear you.
can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. My internet connection is a little bit slow. So I have a question in the same kind of line. I'm just taking from my experience that I submitted an article to a journal. So after getting the peer-reviewed comments, so I actually wrote the rebuttal letter and then also addressed those comments which they given. But then what happened, instead of like giving me their, you know, the answers of, you know, their decisions, the editor wrote to me that, oh, we could not get in touch with those reviewers anymore. And then they sent the article again to a third reviewer. And the third reviewer's comments were really not, I mean, as part of, like, you know, the subject that I'm taking, I was reading the reviewers, the third reviewers, it seemed to me that he's not in the field at all. So then I kind of trying to address it, but then I saw those comments which were not really, I mean, not what I was expecting. And then I kind of gave up, not submitting the article anymore. I felt offended because, you know, doing these peer reviews and working on the comments again and trying to address them, and the editor kind of, you know, shifted then to another reviewer. So what do you think about this kind of experience and how to deal with those issues? I mean, I didn't submit anymore my article to that journal.
Right. Okay.
Thank you.
Are you working in quite a narrow area where there aren't that many academics working?
It's on traditional music.
Right. But what I mean is, would there be, how many people would you think of as being potential peer reviewers in your area? Is it a very small number or is it quite a large number?
I mean, related to Central Asia, there are quite large number of reviewers.
Right. Okay.
So the
I'm
third
just-
reviewer that which I got was not kind of, I just sensed that he was not in the field at all, because the terminology that was in the article, he was questioning them, and it showed to me that he was not even
Right.
familiar with those terminology at all.
I mean, this may be a case where it, you know, the editors found it quite hard to get a reviewer. And it may, I mean, I'm assuming your article was written in English.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
So,
it was written.
I mean, you say there are a few people working in this area, but are they all, you know, people who write in English, or, you know, would they be working in other languages? It may be that the editor doesn't have a very good network of people who know about this topic, and therefore kind of went to you know, the people that they knew, and then that those people themselves are quite busy, and therefore they weren't able to kind of look at a revised manuscript, which is why they went to a third person, and that third person wasn't an expert. So I'm just sort of trying to explain why an editor might make a decision like that. I mean, when you say you wrote a rebuttal, does that mean you refuse to accept any of the points that were made by the reviewers?
I mean, some of the points that they made, it was kind of acceptable, so I addressed them. Some of them, which I, for example, thought that, yes, you are right, but I'm arguing, or in this sense, like this and like that. So I gave, again, kind of, you know, argument. So I just kind of addressed their comments, which was kind of, you know, showing that I have worked on revise this things again. And so I think, to me, it seems more like, you know, a good paper, and it should have been kind of published. But, you know, once I got the third comments or third reviewer, without even telling me what about the two reviewers' comments, which I already, you know, addressed.
Right.
So then you got a third reviewer, then it was really, really offending. So I don't know, like, whether people have this kind of experience or no, but in my case, it was.
Are you doing a PhD at the moment?
Yes.
And has your supervisor read the article and made any comments to you?
I mean, it was before, like, a chapter of my thesis, which I modified a little bit. So he has seen that before.
Right. I just wondered whether, if you wanted some direct feedback, you know, another opinion, you know, could you, you know, talk to your supervisor about it directly, and kind of whether they could give you some suggestions as to, you know, what you could do to get it published. And just sort of thinking about, in terms of, you know, without actually looking at the detail of your, you know, having seen your article and knowing kind of what it is that somebody might have not liked about it. I mean, in general, I mean, and was it, I guess you submitted it to a journal that was relevant in the right area. It was kind of an obvious journal that somebody writing on your topic would apply to. Do you think it was a mainstream journal, if you like, or was it something?
Yeah, it was in the Central Asian journals, which are, you know, publishing all about Central Asia.
Right. Okay. Well, without kind of knowing all the details, I mean, do you think you've kind of ended your attempts to publish with that journal, or would you want to go back with a revised manuscript?
I mean, once I got this kind of, experience, I kind of stopped submitting to this journal anymore. So
okay. I would say
ended
don't get emotional about this. Rejection.
No. It's not about emotion. I'm just asking your own experience or your own views on this kind of experience people might have. I'm not saying that I'm being emotional. I'm just sharing my experience of, how can we deal with this kind of situation if we end up, working on this, and then, the editor would, send your instead of like, addressing those two reviewers comments, but, directing it to the third reviewer, which, I mean, I don't know.
You never know, those interviewers, one may have gotten, so one of the reviewers, one might have gone on maternity leave and the other might be organizing a big conference. You never know what's going on behind the scenes. And they might have said, oh, I can do this week, but they 2 weeks later they're busy or whatever. So don't assume that it's a kind of personal and pointed thing. It may be that the editor of the journal has received several publications in the same area and feels that they have asked their favorite reviewers too many times to do these kind of jobs, and so therefore they're looking for other people to do it. So there may be very, mundane explanations for some of this. We're not always working with optimal circumstances. So yeah, I mean, if you feel like, you want to pursue this particular journal because it's the best journal, I would revise, and really try and address these various points, and show the editor how you've addressed these points rather than necessarily rebutting them. And try not to give them any reasons not to publish. Do it that way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Gulzat, you got your finger.
Yeah, I have a question, because I just want to go back to some of the points that you made right at the beginning, like in terms of what makes it successful, right, to go through the process smoothly. So you mentioned things like strong arguments, and I wanted you to a little bit kind of not really long, but kind of mention what do you mean by strong argument, because sometimes I think it also feels, especially for early career researchers, like what is it actually? And I think in relation to that, I'm sorry, I have a double question actually. Does it need to situate, for instance, this argument within the literature in Central Asia, only looking at the authors from Central Asian region? Or does it need to be, because it's, your journal is Asian affairs, and it's more kind of also globally kind of, reaching as well? Or does it need to situate within the literature outside of the Central Asian region as well? Yeah.
Okay, those are both good questions. In terms of an argument, I suppose the one way of thinking about it is, can you answer the questions how and why, not just what? Yeah. How did this happen? Why did this happen? Not just tell me what happened. Yeah. Why did the irrigation project fail? Why did the government fall? How was it that a certain politician became president? Kind of, what's your argument here as to kind of that explains something, doesn't just describe a situation, but explains it. I guess that would be another way of putting it. And academics, they like to have models and explanations and theories. So in your research, your reading, your literature review, I imagine your supervisors will have encouraged you to read other people's work about the topic, and that those people will have arguments, about anything, whether it's music and the diffusion of musical styles or whatever, kind of how and when did they move, or whether it's politics or international affairs. So yeah, kind of know that background and talk about how your work relates to those. Do you think those people are correct? Are they incorrect? Are they You know, does their work need updating, modifying because of what you found? Those are the things, you know, you don't have to, in a 5,000 to 7,000 word article, you don't have to go into that too deeply, but you just have to, you know, take your hat off in the right direction, you know, kind of acknowledge these various people who've gone before and show how your work connects to them. So that's what I mean by an argument, really. And then how, in what context? Well, it's up to you, really. And depends kind of how specialized your area is. If there's only a few people working in it, then you're only going to relate to, you know, those few people. But I guess the more international the journal is, the more international, you know, you want to make references to. And it may well be that there is a very lively debate about a particular issue, maybe in, say, Russian or another language, which has not become available to English speakers because they simply can't read the literature. And if you're the person that sort of brings these arguments to the attention of English speakers, then great, you might get a lot more attention than the people who actually came up with the arguments because you can do so in a different language, in an international, more international language, in English. So yeah, I wouldn't say there's a hard and fast rule on that. But the more international the journal, the more international, I guess, your references should be.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience?
Is there anything in the chat? Sorry, I haven't been looking at the chat. So it's, no, someone's explained about ORCID and the journal. Yeah, that's great. That's fine. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm more than happy to receive material or proposals. Sometimes people kind of contact me and they say, you know, I have an article about the following subject. Would this be suitable for your journal? And I'm more than happy to kind of respond to that when it's own. Just send me a paragraph or something. Sometimes that's enough just to get an idea about whether there's an argument and whether it's relevant, that kind of thing. Emmanuel.
I came in very late, so I don't know if this has been answered, but as an editor, I mean, what does it mean when you write an article and then on the journal tracking system, you see that it has moved to the editor and it's taken quite long? Doesn't mean anything. It takes like about a month or two, and it still shows that it's with the editor.
Is that the first stage in the process, or has it been through the peer review?
No, it begins from the journal administrator, then to the editor, then review.
Right. It probably just means that the editor's quite busy, because I mean, I'm paid to be the editor, but I'm paid for about a day and a half a week. Okay, and there's quite a lot for me to do in that day and a half, including, for example, book reviews and bits of editing. And there are quite a lot of journals where they don't pay their editor. The editor is doing it while being a lecturer and all the rest of it. And so they just, maybe they put in their diary, Thursday afternoons journal, and then something happens on Thursday afternoon and they don't get around to it. So, I mean, if it's been a month and you haven't heard from anything, feel free to maybe send a polite email, said, I just wondered if there was any news. Assume that you're not the only person in this situation, and maybe this poor editor's got a stack of, 10 other articles to look at. And they're thinking about all these questions about English and argument and who would be the peer reviewer and all that kind of stuff. But, sometimes we need a bit of a reminder, to get on with this work. There's, a couple of emails I haven't answered, and I hope I'm not upsetting anybody by doing that. I have no ill intentions towards those people. I just haven't got around to doing it yet because of other things that I've been doing. So yeah, don't hassle them, every week or something, but every now and then, I think it's a good thing.
Okay, yeah, because I guess the kind of feeling is whether or not you get a desk reject or it will actually move into reviewing.
Yeah,
which is quite good because you get comments back regardless.
Yeah, I mean, it will be, if you get a rejection from the first desk review, it would be nice if you get something that helps you to develop the piece. I mean, at the moment, when I get these articles which are clearly being written by contractors, I send a very simple, sorry, this is not suitable for our journal. I don't give a full explanation. But if somebody has clearly, put lots of work in, has something interesting to say, but the argument isn't clear or whatever, then I try and give them a bit of feedback like that. So yeah, I think it's fair to ask for some direction if you get a rejection. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. But I think it's also good to actually kind of have in mind the length, right, of the whole kind of, process of kind of submitting and then, getting it published, because in some of the journals, if they're really like top journals, it can take actually up to 2 or sometimes even up to 3 years. So I think we need to keep in mind, I think, even that kind of, length, and be ready, I think, sometimes to actually wait. But I think, yes, it's difficult, especially when you're early career researcher, you're either finishing your PhD or just finished. And then, in order to get a job or a postdoc, you also need to show your publication rate, right? And you don't know, like, if it's rejected or not rejected, and you don't know, like, if I need to submit it to another journal or not. But I think, I think if it is a really good journal, I mean, my latest publication, I think it took 2 or maybe even more years in total. Because
I don't feel so bad now. I don't feel so bad now.
No, I think it also depends. And I think that's why I think your suggestion, Bill, of thinking of strategies, like, in terms of which journal to choose, I think it could be also good to think about it as a strategy, because some of the journals might take long time, but it's worse because it's disciplinary journal and you really want to publish in there, and you're willing to wait. But at the same time, I think it would be really good to have mid-level journals where you publish and get it out, maybe not everything, but at least some bit of your research. But in that journal, maybe the process might take a shorter period of time, rather than.
I mean, I think something like the Journal of Asian Studies, which is obviously the journal of the American Association of Asian Studies, which has a huge conference, hundreds, thousands of members or whatever. They have a massive queue to get published. Okay, so even if they accept it, it's going to take a long time, and there's a high bar to get accepted. So, unless you think it's absolutely revolutionary, your work, maybe aim a little bit lower, especially for your first one. Yeah.
I think we have a question in chat from George Shanbei about, does Asian Affairs publish on music?
Well, I think if it was of general relevance, I mean, I think if you're something very niche about, I don't know, I'm afraid I know very little about academic writing about music. If you're talking about the transmission of a tonal system or something, possibly that's not, that's going to be too specialized for us. But if you were talking about music and culture as a, form of international communication, or I'm making it up here, then possibly. If you can think, if it's going to kind of have a general audience, or if it tells us something about cultural policy and nationalism or something, then that would be something. But if it was very, very niche musicology, possibly not.
Thank you. Do we have more questions?
Go on, Zarina.
Hello, thank you very much. I was just thinking I may go anytime soon, but I would like to ask about your open access policies, because for especially early career researchers to pay thousands of dollars to get your publication be open access, it is impossible, especially if you are from low-income countries, etc. So what are possibilities for this issue? Thank you very much.
I try not to have anything to do with the open access question, because I don't want to be publishing something because somebody has paid. Okay, I want to publish because it's good. Okay, and I want the open access to be dealt with by the commercial side of the publication. Okay, so there are various. I mean, we have done things where we have put things on open access. For example, say the protests in Iran. We thought it would be a good idea to make an article about Iran open access, because then people would look at it, it would generate citations perhaps, and then I guess when it becomes closed access, it still becomes, it's still a reference text or whatever. I mean, there are various models about open access and increased. I mean, I don't know where you're studying, but for example, I think there's a consortium of universities, and they will have a subscription model with the publisher. And they will basically pay for a block of open access as part of their subscription to the journal. Yeah, so that academics working in those universities will basically be able to publish open access without them or their particular research budget having to pay directly for the open access. Okay, I don't know whether that would apply to you and where you're studying. But it might, and those kind of arrangements are spreading. But as you say, it's unlikely that a university in a less rich university is going to be able to do that. So, I mean, in terms of open access and what it means for you, obviously it means more people can read it, but there are other ways of kind of getting your work known, and part of that's going to be about the publicity that you do, and Twitter and emailing and going out on the conference circuit and offering presentations and that kind of thing, and hopefully that would generate citations anyway, regardless of whether the thing is open access, because the people who might cite you will be based at universities that will have access agreements on those particular journals. And of course, the downside is that maybe your fellow, assuming you're based in Central Asia, your fellow scholars in Central Asia may not be able to see it. Okay, but then they can all. I mean, I shouldn't tell you this, but you can always email them a PDF. Yeah. And get your work known that way. So you might just have to be a bit creative about that. And I guess when it comes to the point at which you are pitching postdoc proposals and research grants and things, you'll be thinking about whether you're going to put in, as part of that funding proposal, the open access payment, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you. I think that is a really good question as well. And it is becoming one of the issues, I guess. But as you said, there are sometimes also alternatives, right? I think I had a conversation with a research officer from Swansea University, which I just joined recently, saying that you can also put your or accepted versions, I think, on Academia Edu or ResearchGate as well. Mm-hmm. And obviously, it's not the final version, which the journal publishes later on, but at least people can have access to some texts and know what you're writing about as well. And I think quite a lot of people use those kind of strategies. Do we have one more question, or is it all? No? Okay. I think if you don't have more questions from the audience, we can all say thank you to you, Bill.